A dry wind swept across the New Mexico plains, carrying dust and the scent of sage into the air. The sky burned gold as the sun dipped behind the distant red mesas. And a single stagecoach rumbled down the narrow trail cutting through the wilderness. Inside sat a young woman, her gloved hands folded tight over a small leather Bible. She had never been this far from civilization before, never seen so much open land that seemed to stretch forever. Her name was not known to the passengers who had ridden beside her for days, and she preferred it that way. She was a mail-order bride, promised to a man she had never met. Bound for a ranch she had only read, about in a letter that now lay pressed close to her heart, she had left behind the cold cobblestone streets of Boston, trading church bells for coyote howls. Every mile westward felt like a step away from the world she once knew, and a step closer to something unknown, something wild. Rumors had reached even the eastern cities about the Apaches of the desert, about the tribes who ruled the land long before settlers came. They called one of them the Apache King, a man said to command warriors with silent glances. A man who could stop an ambush with a single gesture. Some said he was ruthless. Others whispered that he protected those the frontier forgot. When the stagecoach broke an axle near the foothills, the driver cursed under his breath. "We'll have to camp here till morning," he said. The woman stepped out, her boots sinking into the red dirt. The night closed around them quick, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound. The stars looked close enough to touch. She wrapped her shawl tighter, her heart thudding faster than it should. Then she heard it, the faint rhythm of drums somewhere beyond the trees, deep and distant, like a heartbeat coming from the earth itself. "Best stay near the fire." "Ma'am," said an old ranch hand, poking at the flames, "these lands ain't safe at night. Apaches ride here." His words hung heavy in the smoke. She did not sleep. The wilderness had its own voice, the rustle of wind through pine, the hoot of an owl, and somewhere far off, the call of a coyote echoing across the canyon. She stared into the darkness, half hoping, half fearing that she might see a figure watching from the ridge. By dawn, the driver managed to fix the wheel, and the coach rolled on. As they passed a stretch of forest, she saw movement between the trees, fleeting silent shadows on horseback. No one else seemed to notice. A shiver ran down her spine, but she did not speak. It wasn't until they reached a burned-out settlement that she understood the danger. Charred beams jutted from the ground like broken bones. Smoke still curled from the ruins. The driver's face went pale. "They were attacked," he muttered. "Looks like raiders again." But there were no bodies, only tracks leading into the forest, and strange symbols carved into the dirt. She felt something stir inside her, pity maybe, or fear, she couldn't tell. The men decided to turn back, fearing another ambush, but the woman refused. "I can't go back," she said softly. "I've come too far." And before they could stop her, she took her small suitcase and started walking down the path alone. Hours passed. The sun burned hotter, and the land grew wilder. Her throat was dry, her steps heavy, but pride kept her moving. She stumbled upon a river bend where wild horses drank, and knelt beside them, scooping water with her trembling hands. When she looked up, one of the horses lifted its head, and behind it stood a man. He was unlike anyone she had ever seen. His presence filled the air like thunder. Broad-shouldered, bare-chested, with dark hair falling past his shoulders, and tribal jewelry glinting against his skin. His eyes were deep, sharp as the edge of a blade, and yet strangely calm. A bow hung across his back, and the paint on his chest told stories of war and spirit. She froze. Clutching her shawl, unsure whether to run or speak, "You are lost," he said quietly. His voice low, but steady. "I'm looking for Redstone Ranch," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze lingered on her torn gloves and dust-covered dress. "That land is gone," he said. "No one lives there now." Her knees weakened. "Gone," he nodded once. "Burned in the spring raids? The white man who owned it took his cattle east." The truth hit her like a strike to the chest. All the miles, all the hope, and for what? She turned away, tears mixing with dust. But before she could move, he stepped closer. "You cannot stay here alone," he said. This land will not forgive weakness. She glanced up at him, heart pounding. Then why haven't you taken me prisoner? For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind rustled between them. Because I am not your enemy, he finally said. Come. He led her through the forest, his movements silent and sure. The trees opened into a clearing where the air smelled of cedar smoke and river water. Warriors watched from a distance, curious but not hostile. The woman's pulse raced as she entered a world few outsiders ever saw. Children laughed near a stream. Women ground corn beside fires. It was not the savage camp she had imagined. It was alive. Breathing, full of quiet rhythm and respect, he guided her toward a lodge built of hides and branches. You will rest here, he said. You are safe. She hesitated. Why help me? His eyes met hers. Because you crossed the desert without fear? That is not something I see often. She recovered slowly, learning to draw water from the stream, to braid her hair differently, to speak with her hands when words failed. The people treated her with wary kindness. And yet, each night, she found her thoughts returning to the man who had saved her. He moved through the village like a shadow, respected, obeyed, yet distant from all. They called him their king, though he wore no crown. One evening, as the sun bled red through the pines, he found her near the archery range. She watched the young warriors practice, their arrows slicing the air. He stepped behind her and handed her a bow. Try, he said. I've never done this, she murmured. He stood close, his hand guiding hers, his breath warm against her cheek. The bow does not obey fear, he whispered. It obeys balance. Strength and calm together. She drew the string back, trembling. The arrow flew and struck the target's edge. A small victory, but enough to make her smile for the first time in weeks. He smiled faintly, his eyes softening. You have fire, he said. Hidden but strong. That night, as a storm gathered beyond the hills, the woman sat by the fire, listening to the drums echoing through the rain. Something inside her stirred, something that had been buried under loneliness and fear. She realized she no longer felt like a stranger. Yet part of her still belonged to another world, a world that might come searching for her. In the distance, a single gunshot cracked the night. The drums stopped. Warriors rose, silent and alert. The Apache king stepped from the shadows, bow in hand, his expression unreadable. He looked toward her once, and though no words were spoken, she understood. Danger was coming. She rose to her feet, heart racing. He touched her arm gently and said in a low, steady voice, Stay by the fire. Whatever happens, do not run. She swallowed hard. Who are they? He looked into the dark, where shapes were moving among the trees. Men who think this land can be owned, he said. But tonight, they will learn otherwise. Lightning split the sky, and the rain began to fall. She watched him walk into the storm, bow drawn, every movement powerful and calm. For the first time, she understood why they called him king, not for his crown, but for the weight he carried, the silence he commanded. The last thing she heard before the thunder swallowed his steps was his voice. Calm and certain. Come, rest now, he had told her hours before. But rest would not come easily, not while the wilderness waited to decide whether she would belong to it or be taken by it. The rain poured through the night, turning the earth into dark clay and soaking through every thread of her dress. She waited by the fire as he had told her to, the flicker of flames painting shadows on the lodge walls. Every crack of thunder made her heart jump. Outside, the sound of horses echoed through the valley, hooves pounding, voices shouting in a language she didn't understand. She pressed her palms together and prayed silently, not knowing who she was praying for anymore, herself, or the man who had walked into the storm. When the noise faded, dawn crept over the mountains, gray and heavy. Smoke lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of wet cedar. She stepped outside, her boots sinking into the mud. The camp was quiet, too quiet. A few warriors returned at sunrise, their faces unreadable. Some carried arrows broken in half, Others bore shallow cuts on their arms. She searched their faces, but he was not among them. An older woman approached her, one she had come to recognize as a respected matron among the tribe. "You must eat," the woman said softly, handing her a clay bowl. The woman's eyes, though kind, carried something else, pity, maybe warning. She took the bowl with trembling hands, the warm broth sending steam against her face. "Where is he?" she asked quietly. The woman looked toward the ridgeline where fog still clung to the trees. "He will return if the spirits allow it," she said. "He walks between two worlds, the one that takes life and the one that saves it." Hours passed before she saw him again. He came walking down from the hills, his shoulders wet, his bows stained with rain and ash. She ran to him, then stopped halfway, afraid to seem foolish. His expression was calm, though his eyes were darker than before. "It is done," he said simply. She wanted to ask what had happened, but something in his tone silenced her. The warriors gathered around him, speaking in low voices. He listened, nodded once, and dismissed them with a single gesture. Then his gaze met hers. "You did well," he said. "You stayed?" Her throat tightened. "I didn't know if you'd come back." A faint smile flickered across his face. "The land still has use for me." He turned toward the rising sun. "Come, there is something you must see." He led her up a narrow trail through the forest until they reached a bluff overlooking the valley. The view stretched for miles, rivers cutting through canyons, hawks circling high above, the world untouched and wild. Smoke from burned wagons rose in the distance. He pointed toward it. "Those who came last night were not raiders," he said. "They were settlers. They wanted to drive my people from this land." She watched the smoke twist into the pale sky. "And you stopped them?" His jaw tightened. "For now." She looked at him then, really looked. There was strength in his calm, but also weariness. "Does it ever end?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Not while the land remembers blood." They stood in silence, the wind tugging at her hair. She could feel the pull between their worlds, hers of letters and promises, his of dust and spirit. Something unspoken lingered there, fragile but alive. When they returned to the camp, children ran to greet him. He knelt to speak with them, their small hands touching his arm as if to confirm he was real. Watching him, she saw a different side, not just the warrior who fought, the leader who carried everyone's burdens. That evening, she sat by the fire again, this time among the people. They shared food, laughter, and stories she could only half understand. A young girl offered her a handmade bracelet of woven fiber and beads. "For protection," the child said, pressing it into her palm. The gesture warmed her heart in a way she hadn't expected. Later, he joined her by the flames. The tribe's drummers played softly, and the air smelled of roasted corn and pine resin. "You learn quickly," he said, sitting beside her. "I'm trying," she replied. "But I don't belong here." He looked at her for a long moment. "Perhaps not, but the land chooses who it keeps." She hesitated. "Why do they call you king?" His expression shifted, not pride, but something like burden. "It was not a title I asked for," he said. "My father led before me. When he fell, they looked to me. But a king does not own the land, he only listens to it." She nodded slowly, drawn to the quiet depth in his words. "And do you ever rest?" A small smile touched his lips. "Rest is for men who forget their purpose." The wind rose, scattering embers into the dark. She watched them drift upward like tiny stars. "Back east, I used to dream of a husband who would build me a home," she said softly. "Someone who would bring me peace. But the letters lied. The man I was to marry is gone now. Maybe it was never real." He turned toward her, his eyes unreadable. "Peace is not always found in walls and roofs," he said. "Sometimes it is found where the heart learns to fight and forgive." His words lingered in her chest long after he walked away. That night, she dreamed of the fire, of arrows flying through the rain, and of his voice, calm and low, saying her name though she wasn't sure he ever had. Over the next few days, the air grew tense again. Scouts returned with word that soldiers were moving closer, men from the forts who wanted to push the tribes farther south. She saw the change in him. He spoke less, spent long hours by the river sharpening his arrows and whispering to the wind. One morning she followed him. He stood at the edge of the canyon, bow in hand, watching the horizon. The sky was gray, the air still. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning. "I just wanted to understand," she said. "There is nothing to understand," he replied. "War is a circle. It never ends. But there must be another way." He finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. "You speak as if the world listens to mercy. Out here, mercy is taken for weakness." She stepped closer. "Then let them think you weak for one moment. Just long enough to live." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "You speak like someone who has lost everything. That is why you are not afraid." Her breath caught. "And what have you lost?" He looked past her, toward the land that seemed to stretch into forever. "My brother," he said after a long pause. He trusted the peace treaties. They shot him when he tried to parley. She felt the ache behind his words. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "The land remembers. So must I." The wind picked up, carrying dust across the canyon floor. Below them, she saw riders, soldiers in uniform, their rifles glinting in the light. "They're close," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "And they will not stop until this valley belongs to them." She looked at him, fear rising in her chest. "What will you do?" He reached for his bow and checked the string. "What I must." That night the camp prepared quietly. Fires were dimmed. Horses were moved into the trees. The children were hidden with the elders deep in the hills. She helped carry water, her hands shaking but determined. The women around her moved with silent precision, their faces calm despite the storm that hung in the air. When she finished her tasks, she found him near the firelight, his profile etched against the glow. He was binding his wrists with strips of leather, marking himself for battle. She approached slowly. "Will you come back?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "If the land wills it." She wanted to say more, to beg him not to go, but her voice caught in her throat. He looked at her one last time, and in that single glance, she felt more than words could ever carry. When the riders came at dawn, the sky burned with streaks of red and gold. She stood hidden behind the trees, clutching the bracelet the child had given her. The clash of gunfire and arrows filled the air. Smoke rolled through the valley. She saw him atop the ridge, his bow drawn. Every movement, fluid, fearless. It's like the spirit of the land itself. Her heart pounded as she whispered the words he had once said to her. That peace was found where the heart learned to fight and forgive. But forgiveness felt far away now, buried under fear and the echo of gunfire. Then, through the smoke, she saw him fall to one knee. Her breath caught, her whole body trembling. The world seemed to still for that one terrible moment. She wanted to run to him, to scream his name, but all she could do was watch powerless, frozen as the valley below filled with chaos. Somewhere, deep within the storm, his voice reached her again, faint but certain, like a promise carried on the wind. "Do not run," he had said once. And she didn't. She stood her ground, even as the battle roared around her, even as the smoke thickened. Because something told her that this was not the end, that the story of the Apache king and the mail-order bride had only just begun. The smoke from the battle still hung in the air the next morning. Curling through the pine trees like ghostly fingers, the woman walked carefully through the wet ground, her dress torn and her shoes caked with mud. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and burnt wood. Somewhere in the distance, a raven cried out, the sound hollow and long. She called for him softly, her voice trembling, but only silence answered. The camp lay in ruins, broken arrows, shattered pottery, and ashes where fires once burned bright. She had never seen so much loss, not even back east when sickness swept through the towns. This was something different, something raw and ancient. She found him near the riverbank, half covered in blood and dirt, sitting against a tree. His shoulder was wounded, an arrowhead lodged deep near his collarbone, but he was alive. Relief swept through her like fire. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she reached for him. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured, his voice rough. "I couldn't stay back," she said, pressing a cloth against his wound. "You told me not to run. I listened." A faint smirk flickered across his face before pain stole it away. "Then you are learning the ways of this land." She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with water from the river and wrapping it as tightly as she could. He didn't flinch once, though she could see how much it hurt. "You fought for them," she said quietly. "But how many more times can you fight before there's nothing left to protect?" He looked toward the valley, where the smoke rose like dark ribbons. "As long as there is one child left to remember who we are, there will be something to protect." She wanted to argue, but couldn't. His words carried a weight she couldn't touch. Behind them, the few surviving villagers began to gather what they could. The tribe would have to move deeper into the mountains now. The soldiers would return, they always did. For days they traveled through dense forests and winding canyons. The woman walked beside him, helping where she could, though her feet bled and her body ached. The nights were cold, and the sound of coyotes reminded her how far she was from any home she'd ever known. But she no longer feared the darkness. There was a strange kind of safety in being unseen, belonging to no one but the road. At night, when the fires burned low, she often watched him from across the camp. Even injured, he carried himself like someone carved from stone, silent, enduring, unshaken. Children still came to him, and he would lift his hand to bless them before sending them away to sleep. Yet she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that came not from the body, but from the soul. One evening, as the sky turned violet, a young warrior approached their fire. He bowed respectfully, but did not hide the anger in his eyes. "The soldiers will follow us," he said. "We should strike first." The Apache king shook his head. "To fight again so soon would cost more lives than we can spare." "They will never stop," the young man snapped. "Why wait for them to find us?" "Because I do not lead with rage," the king replied firmly. The warrior glared at the woman sitting nearby. "You brought her among us. Since she came, the soldiers have not rested. They come for her, not for us." She froze. The thought had haunted her before, whispered in her own heart, but hearing it aloud made it feel real. The man's accusation cut deep. "She is not their cause," the king said sharply. "The war began long before she crossed the desert." The young warrior's hands clenched into fists. "Then send her away before it ends us all." The fire crackled between them, the silence thick as the night air. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her throat tightened. The king finally said, "Enough. Go." His voice carried a warning, and the warrior obeyed, though his glare lingered on her. After he was gone, she whispered, "He's right, isn't he? I don't belong here. I'm just another reason for them to come." He looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, "If you were the cause of their hate, they would have burned this valley years ago. The truth is simpler. You are a woman who walked into a world not meant for you, and now you must learn how to survive it." His words were neither gentle nor cruel. They were honest. She turned away, staring into the flames. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of her wished she could disappear back into the world she'd left behind. But another part refused to run. The next morning, scouts returned with grim news. A detachment of soldiers had been seen moving north along the ridge. They would reach the tribe's new camp within a day or two. The king ordered everyone to prepare. The wounded were hidden in a cave near the stream, while the others made ready to move again. But before they could leave, something unexpected happened. A wagon approached from the east, its wheels grinding against the rocky path. The woman saw it first, her breath catching when she recognized the faded paint on its side, the same kind used by settlers from her old mail route. Two men rode it, dressed in worn coats, carrying rifles. When they saw the camp, they froze. One of them shouted, "Hold there! We're not here to fight." The warriors raised their bows, but the Apache king lifted his hand, signaling them to wait. "Speak," he called out. The older of the two men stepped forward. "We're looking for a woman, a mail-order bride, who went missing months ago on the road to Redstone Ranch." His eyes swept over the camp until they landed on her. You. Her heart stopped. The sound of her old name on his lips was like hearing a ghost. Who sent you? She asked, stepping closer. Her husband, the man replied. He's been searching for her. Said her stagecoach was lost in a storm. We were sent to bring her back. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The letters, the promise, the journey, all of it came rushing back. But Redstone Ranch had burned. The man she was meant to marry could not still be waiting. That can't be, she whispered. He's gone. The man frowned. No, ma'am. He's alive. He rebuilt the ranch near the river. Been waiting all this time? The Apache King's gaze hardened. You'd think to take her from here? She's a citizen, the man said. Not one of you. You've got no claim on her. The tension between them thickened like storm clouds. The woman stood between both worlds, one that had nearly killed her, and another that had somehow taught her how to breathe again. I need time, she said quietly. The men hesitated, then nodded. We'll camp by the river tonight. At first light, we leave. With or without you. When they were gone, she turned to the king. If what they say is true, I can't stay. His jaw tightened, though his eyes softened for a moment. And if it's not, she shook her head. Then I'll find out. I have to, he said nothing, but his silence said everything. That night, neither of them slept. She sat near the fire, staring at the stars, feeling as if she were being torn apart from the inside. When dawn came, she packed her small satchel. The king stood waiting by the edge of camp. You will not be safe with them, he said. I wasn't safe anywhere before you found me, she replied. But I can't keep hiding. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers for the briefest moment. If they lie, the land will tell me. And I will come, she nodded, her throat too tight for words. The wagon waited by the river, the men already mounted. She climbed aboard, turning once to see him standing by the trees, tall, silent, his hair lifted by the morning wind. The image burned into her heart as the wheels began to turn. Hours passed in uneasy silence. The soldiers' fort lay far to the south, but the wagon turned west instead, following a narrow trail along the canyon rim. The land grew unfamiliar, harsher, and the air carried a strange metallic smell. By midday, her unease grew. The men spoke little, exchanging glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Something felt wrong. Finally, she asked, Where is the ranch? The older man hesitated. We'll reach it by sunset. But his tone betrayed him. Her stomach twisted. She looked at the landscape. No sign of any ranch, no fences, no smoke from a chimney. Only empty land and the distant echo of thunder. Then she saw it, a small campfire down the ridge. With 3 more horses tethered nearby, she realized too late what it meant. They weren't rescuers. They were traders, men who dealt in captives. Before she could move, one of them grabbed her wrist. Don't fight, he said coldly. You're worth more alive. The words hit her like a blade. She struggled, but he was stronger. The wagon lurched as another man took the reins. The land blurred around her. Panic filled her chest. She thought of the king, his voice, his calm, his promise. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, low and fierce, not from the sky, but from the earth itself, as if something ancient had awakened. The Apache king had said the land would tell him, and as the storm gathered over the horizon, she could almost feel it, the air shifting, the wild stirring. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Shadow on horseback was already riding fast through the rain. The wagon rattled down the rocky trail as the storm gathered behind the mountains. The woman's hands were tied, her wrists raw from the rope. Every bump in the road sent pain shooting through her arms, but she stayed silent, her mind racing. The men spoke little now, focused on reaching whatever destination they had planned. The older one kept glancing over his shoulder as if worried something was following them. The wind grew stronger, carrying the scent of rain and the far-off rumble of thunder. She stared at the horizon, praying for a way out. The image of the Apache king burned in her mind, his calm eyes, the promise in his voice. "The land will tell me," he had said. And now, as the sky darkened, she could almost believe it would. They stopped at dusk by a dry ravine, where a crumbling stone ruin stood against the fading light. "We rest here," one of the men ordered. They dragged her from the wagon and tied her to one of the pillars. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of approaching rain. The younger man, tall, lean, with restless eyes, watched her as he sharpened his knife. "You really thought someone sent us to rescue you?" he said with a crooked grin. "Sweet little thing like you, out here alone? You're worth a fortune in silver to the traders across the border." She flinched but didn't reply. He leaned closer, his voice low and cruel. "Don't worry. They treat their captives well if they behave." Before he could say more, the older man snapped, "Enough. She's not to be harmed. Not yet." His tone carried a warning, though even he couldn't hide his greed. They argued in low voices about routes and prices, their words blurring with the rising wind. As the first drops of rain began to fall, she closed her eyes and listened. The storm rolled closer, the thunder louder now, like hooves pounding across the sky. A strange calm filled her chest. She didn't know if rescue was coming, but she felt something watching from the darkness. Beyond the ridge, the men built a fire, but the rain soon smothered it. The night turned black, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything. The younger man cursed under his breath and lit a lantern. Its flickering light threw long, twisted shadows across the ruined walls. Then the horses began to panic. They reared and snorted, tugging at their reins. "What's spooking them?" the older man barked. "I don't see anything," the younger one said, grabbing his rifle. But his voice trembled slightly. The horses broke loose, galloping into the rain. Something moved beyond the trees, a shadow, tall and silent. The younger man fired a shot, the blast echoing through the canyon. Silence followed. Then another thunderclap rolled through the night, so close it shook the ground. "Get the girl!" the older man shouted. "We're leaving." But when the younger one turned toward her, she was gone. The rope lay on the ground, cut clean through. He spun around, panic flaring in his eyes. "She's loose." Lightning split the sky, revealing the narrow path down the ravine. For a brief moment, the men saw her running through the rain, her dress clinging to her legs, hair wild in the wind. They gave chase, shouting threats that vanished beneath the thunder. She stumbled down the slope, her bare feet slipping on the wet stones. The cold rain lashed her face, but she didn't stop. Behind her, gunshots cracked through the storm, one bullet striking the rock inches from her shoulder. She kept running, breath ragged, heart pounding. The world blurred into flashes of light and shadow. When she reached the river, the water was swollen from the storm. It roared like a beast, thrashing against the rocks. She looked behind her. The men were closing in. There was no other way. With a trembling breath, she stepped into the current. The water was icy and strong, dragging at her legs. She fought to keep her footing, clutching a branch as the current pulled harder. Another lightning flash lit the sky, and in that instant, she saw him. At the top of the ridge stood the Apache king, rain streaming down his shoulders, his bow raised. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Then the sound of his arrow cutting through the rain broke the stillness. The younger man fell, his rifle dropping into the mud. The older one turned to run, but another arrow found him before he could take a step. The storm swallowed his scream. The river tore the woman from the branch, pulling her downstream. She gasped for air, choking on water, spinning helplessly in the current. She caught a glimpse of the ridge again, and then she was gone, swept into the darkness. He raced after her, leaping from rock to rock, following the river's edge. The storm made it nearly impossible to see, but he kept moving, guided by instinct. The rain soaked his wounds, but he ignored the pain. All he could think of was finding her before the river took her for good. Downstream, the water thrashed against jagged rocks. She clung to a floating log, her strength fading fast. Every breath burned in her chest. Just when she thought she couldn't hold on any longer, a strong hand grabbed her wrist. He pulled her from the water, dragging her onto the muddy shore. She coughed violently, shivering as he knelt beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the rain and her broken breaths filled the air. "You came?" she whispered weakly. "The land told me," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. He carried her beneath a ledge where the rock offered some shelter from the storm. He wrapped his cloak around her shoulders, though he was soaked himself. His fingers brushed against her cold skin as he checked for wounds. "You're safe now," he said, but even as he spoke, the word felt uncertain. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "They said you wouldn't find me. They were wrong." His gaze hardened. "And there will be more like them. They never stop hunting what they can't control." She shivered, not from the cold, but from the truth in his words. "Then what happens now?" He didn't answer right away. Outside, the storm began to fade, replaced by the sound of the river rushing below. "Now," he said finally, "we prepare for what comes next." They stayed hidden until morning. When the rain lifted, the valley looked washed clean, but the peace was deceptive. Smoke rose again from the east, the soldiers had moved closer. The tribe's scouts would soon return with warnings as they made their way back to camp. She noticed the land around them felt different, quieter, heavier, as if watching them. Every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked alive. By the time they reached the camp, the people were already packing. Warriors carried bows and spears, and the women gathered food and blankets. The children watched silently, understanding more than their young years should allow. One of the elders approached the Apache king. "They come with more guns this time," he said gravely. "If we stay, they will surround us." He nodded. "Then we move before sunset." The woman stood nearby, clutching the bracelet the child had given her. She knew leaving meant abandoning what little they had built, but staying meant death. The weight of it pressed on her chest. She caught his gaze, and in it, she saw what he would never say aloud, that the fight was no longer just about land, but about survival itself. As the sun began to sink, the warriors took their places. He ordered the elders and the children to head north toward the mountains. She stayed behind, refusing to leave him again. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I can help," she insisted. "You said the land chooses who it keeps? Maybe it chose me for this." His expression softened for the first time in days. "Then stay close." The night fell hard and fast. The first sounds of the soldiers came from the ridge horses, shouts, metal clinking. The warriors moved like shadows through the trees, their bows ready. The woman crouched behind a fallen log, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give them away. The soldiers lit torches, their orange glow spreading through the forest. The Apache king motioned for silence, his eyes fixed on their movements. The rain-soaked earth muffled every step. A hawk cried from above, a signal. Then came the answer, a single arrow whistling through the air. The battle began in an instant. Gunfire shattered the stillness, the flashes lighting up faces in the dark. She saw him move fast, precise, fearless, his bow singing with every draw. But the soldiers were many. For every one that fell, two more appeared. The woman grabbed a fallen rifle, fumbling to load it. Her hands trembled, but she steadied herself.
Now remembering his words.
The bow obeys balance, not fear. The air filled with smoke and shouting. She saw one soldier break through the line, aiming at him. Without thinking, she fired. The man dropped. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop. The Apache king glanced toward her, his eyes full of something between anger and pride. But before either could speak, a blast shook the ground dynamite. The explosion sent fire through the trees, throwing them both to the ground. When the dust cleared, the soldiers were regrouping. The forest burned on both sides, and the air turned to smoke. He pulled her to her feet. "We have to move," he said. They ran toward the ridge, the fire chasing them. Every breath seared her lungs, every step a battle. The sound of gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the roar of flames. When they reached the top, she looked back. The valley glowed like a furnace. "They'll follow," she said. He looked down at the burning land, his face unreadable. "Then this is where we make our stand." The wind howled, carrying the sparks into the sky. He drew his last arrow, the firelight gleaming against his skin. She stood beside him, clutching the rifle, her heart hammering in rhythm with his. Below them, the soldiers climbed through the smoke, their torches like stars in the dark. The land that had once been quiet now trembled with fury, and as the fire closed in and the storm of war rose again, she realized this was the moment everything had led to, the edge before the final storm, the breath before the end. The fire roared around them like a living creature, the heat licking the air and the smoke curling up into the sky. The Apache king stood tall at the edge of the ridge, his bow drawn tight, his breath steady despite the chaos that surrounded them. Below, the soldiers struggled up the slope, their torches dimming under the rising smoke. The woman stood beside him, her dress torn, face streaked with soot, clutching the rifle with trembling hands. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, but she refused to let fear take her now. She had come too far, lost too much, to run again. The wind changed suddenly, carrying the flames toward the soldiers instead of the ridge. The fire found the oil from their torches and erupted into a wall of flame. Shouts turned to screams as the men scattered. The storm clouds rolled overhead, heavy with rain, and the first drops began to fall. The fire hissed and cracked as the rain grew stronger, slowly beating the flames down. The Apache king lowered his bow, his eyes following the chaos below. The land itself seemed to be fighting back, cleansing itself of all the pain it had absorbed. When the last of the gunfire faded, silence settled over the mountain. The rain washed away the smoke, revealing a world that looked broken but alive. The woman lowered her rifle, her hand shaking. He turned to her, his dark hair plastered to his face, his eyes calm but tired. "It's over," he said quietly. She looked at him, not sure if she could believe it. "For now," she said. He nodded once. "That's all we ever have." "For now." They stayed there for a while, watching the rain fall over the valley. When the fires were finally gone, he led her down the ridge. The survivors from his tribe were waiting by the river, their faces lit by the faint glow of dawn. The children ran to him, clutching his legs, crying out in relief. The women wept quietly, their hands raised in prayer to the sky. The woman stood apart, sure where she belonged among them. One of the older women came forward, the same one who had once given her a bowl of broth by the fire. She touched the woman's cheek gently and said, "You have seen what we see. You have felt what we feel. The land has marked you now." The words brought tears to her eyes. She looked at the Apache king, and he gave a small nod. "You are not a stranger anymore," he said softly. Days passed as they rebuilt what they could. The tribe moved north into the mountains, where the land was greener, and the soldiers would not easily follow. The woman helped the children gather herbs and carry water. The scars of battle remained, but there was a quiet determination in every person she saw. Even in loss, they found a reason to go on. At night, she often sat by the river, listening to the water rushing over the stones. He would sometimes join her, sitting in silence beside her, the sound of the stream speaking for them. One evening she asked, "What happens now? To you? To them?" He looked out across the valley, his reflection rippling in the water. "We live," he said. "That is how we win. The land will change, the people will change, but if our spirit stays, we are not gone." She thought of her old life, the letters, the city streets, the promise of a man she never met. It all felt like another lifetime. "I thought I was coming here to be someone's wife," she said quietly, "but I think I came here to become myself." He turned to her, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "The land does not always give what we ask," he said. "Sometimes it gives what we need." Their eyes met, and for a long moment, the world seemed still. She saw in him not the warrior the stories had described, but the man who had carried the weight of his people, the one who had fought not just for survival but for meaning. And he saw in her not the frightened outsider who had stumbled into his world, but someone who had faced the same storms and stood unbroken in the weeks that followed. She learned more about their ways, how they read the wind, how they listened to the earth before planting or traveling, how they spoke to the spirits of those who came before. The more she learned, the less she thought about returning east. The life she had known there seemed small and pale compared to the one she had found here. But one morning, a rider arrived at the camp carrying a message. It was written in English, the paper crumpled and wet from travel. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from the man who had once been her intended. He was alive after all, running a small ranch by the river, just as the men had said. The words were full of regret and longing, begging her to come back, to start anew. She held the letter for a long time, staring at the ink as if it might fade. The choice weighed heavy on her heart, between the world she was born into and the one she had fought to understand. That evening, she found the Apache king by the edge of the camp. He was watching the sunset, the sky streaked with red and gold. "I got a letter," she said softly. He didn't look surprised. "And what does it ask of you?" "To come back?" He nodded slowly. "Then you must decide which voice is yours, the one that calls you back or the one that tells you to stay." She looked at him, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "And if I leave?" He met her gaze steadily. "Then you will carry this place with you. You will always hear its song, even in your sleep. And one day, when the wind blows from the west, you will remember." The next morning, she packed her few things, the shawl, the bracelet from the child, a small pouch of river stones. The tribe gathered to say farewell, their faces warm but solemn. She turned to him last. "I don't know if I'll ever find peace," she said. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "Peace is not found," he said. "It is made. Wherever you go, make it." Her throat tightened as she whispered, so powerful. Whispered the mail-order bride, breathless. Her voice trembled on the edge of tears. He looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Come rest now," said the Apache king. She smiled faintly, then turned and walked down the path toward the open plains. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying with it the faint smell of cedar and smoke. Behind her, the mountains rose high and silent, guardians of the stories they now both carried. Weeks later, she reached the edge of the river valley. She saw the ranch that had once been promised to her. It stood rebuilt, neat and orderly, the fences lined straight. The man who waited there had kind eyes, but when he spoke, his voice sounded distant, like an echo from a world she no longer belonged to. She stayed for a time, helping tend the horses and repair the barn, but each evening she would stand outside, staring toward the mountains where the sky burned red at dusk. In her heart, she carried two worlds, one of wood and letters, and one of fire and wind. Sometimes when the night grew quiet, she would hear the river's song again and close her eyes, feeling the warmth of the hand that had once saved her. Years passed, and stories spread through the frontier about the Apache king who vanished after the Great Fire. Some said he died in the mountains. Others said he became one with the land itself. But she knew better. She knew he lived as long as the wind blew across the plains and the rain washed the earth clean. One evening, as the sky darkened over the horizon, a storm rolled in from the west. The rain came hard and fast, and the thunder shook the ground. She stepped outside and felt the drops against her face. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying a voice she would never forget, and for the first time in many years, she smiled. The story of the mail-order bride and the Apache king had ended, not in loss, but in understanding that love was not a cage, nor a promise written on paper, but something born from the land itself, strong enough to live on long after both had gone.